Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Brian Heap, who's going to speak to us this evening on being a Christian in science. He's immensely well qualified to speak to us. He is the former master of St Edmund's College and now an honorary fellow, and well, many distinctions. He's on the European Advisory Board of the Templeton Foundation and a former judge of the Templeton Prize. He has doctorates from the Universities of Nottingham and Cambridge in animal physiology, and he's published widely on endocrine physiology, biotechnology, sustainable consumption, and science advice. He's a member of many committees. And he's been president of the Institute of Biology. I could go on. Perhaps chief among these would be Foreign Secretary and Vice President of the Royal Society. But he's also a member of the UK's Nuffield Council on Bioethics and advises on that and biotechnology and many other areas. So I think without further ado, I think I'll just introduce Brian to you and let you speak.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and I'm going to take quite a personal position on aspects of being a Christian in science. So this isn't going to be in the nature of an academic lecture or a scientific lecture. It's going to be very much a more personal comment. And the subject area, of course, science and religion, is one that is very prominent these days, as I'm sure you're all aware. And just every day books seem to come out. Here's one that I've just had today, Oracles of Science. Celebrity scientists versus God and religion. And if you've read your Economist this week, you will have seen in the current issue that it's devoted, a whole section of it is devoted to new wars of religion. Very interesting and well worth reading because of its relevance to the area that we're discussing. And in that series of papers, the president of Iran is quoted remarkably as writing to President Bush that the world is gravitating towards the Almighty, whether we like it or not. Now, those of us who live in the UK might find that rather difficult to believe, but if you look at the global scene, you'll see in these articles how the case is made for that particular observation. The observation is also made that the militant atheist section is also growing at a significant rate. So alongside all this that's been happening in the field of religion, science, engineering and technology have also been developing in a remarkable way, particularly in the more advanced, the more developed countries, but of course some of the less developed countries are motoring ahead with their SET, science, engineering and technology, very considerably. And countries like India and China especially, of course. And many of the policymakers and the politicians today, especially in our own country and also in the USA, recognize that science and technology are major drivers of economic success. And so we see this very great emphasis. In this country, for example, this government has just decided that all the research councils which are responsible for funding science in the UK should have an increase this year on average of 20%. And that is entirely for the purpose of generating more work in the area of what is referred to as innovation, not the creation of new knowledge for the purpose of subsequently applying it, but a direct drive to enhance the amount of science and technology that is carried out for economic success. So the parallel areas of science and religion are undergoing considerable change and expansion in different ways, of course. And The Economist warns of fierce, use the word fierce, cultural battles about science in particular. And so it's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this Faraday course. It's a very important course for the Faraday Institute because this provides the link with people who have key positions within the churches and who are leaders and are thinking about how one comes to terms with these cultural changes that are occurring in so many countries and which we need to be well aware of. And I promise that at least in my presentation I won't use the D word. Though you may have noticed it on the board. Now, when our relatively new Prime Minister came into power, he dropped speaking about the war against terrorism. And many of us were greatly relieved that he did that. But I think it's true, and I suspect we would all agree, that we are in a war against militant atheism. And its implications were summarized by G.K. Chesterton, who said, when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. So the award of a substantial grant to the Faraday Institute for the establishment of the Faraday Institute, of which I'm chairman of the advisory board by the John Templeton Foundation, has proved very timely because of all the activity that has developed in this particular field in recent years. Just a word about Sir John Templeton, who is a very interesting man, now in his 90s, living these days in Nassau, in the Bahamas, made immense personal wealth in the financial markets of the world, was deeply involved in the establishment of mutual bonds, and by the age of 60 was a multi-millionaire, retired, went to live in Nassau, got bored within a month of playing golf, decided to set up another company in his house, in his box room, became a multi-billionaire by the age of 80, and decided to use the income from his investments, vast investments, to stimulate work in the field of science and religion. And apparently he gives away about between $50 and $60 million a year. By 2012, it's estimated that he will give away $100 million a year. And he believes that science is crucial to modern societies, but he also believes that there is much more to be discovered in the realm of spiritual realities and searching for God. And so, for example, the annual Templeton Prize is set at a value which is always greater than the Nobel Prize, for that very reason. And this year it was just short of £1 million. Of course, people who write militant atheist books in this area may earn even more than that, but at least it started a very vigorous debate. And so the course that you're starting on, we hope, and I'm speaking for Rodney here really, I'm sure he hopes it will stimulate and provide you with access to some of the vibrant aspects of this topic, some of which can be quite threatening, but others of which are challenging and provide real opportunities for more debate. Now, conflict is what most people think about when we start to talk about science and religion debate. Whether it's questions about the origin of the universe, where it all started, the type of things that George Ellis was speaking about tonight, or how species emerged and all the conflicts that exist in terms of speciation, evolutionary biology, intelligent design, and so on. But some say that science and religion ask radically different questions, and they're satisfied with that. So they have these two, what are often referred to as non-overlapping magisteria, two different areas. The how question and the why question, which require very different treatment. And others say that religion at a deep level can support and nourish the entire scientific enterprise. That's often referred to, of course, as the conversation approach. And I think it's an area that we would hope is something that could be developed much more. And so let's just take a gentle introduction into this area and think about it from the point of view of being a Christian in science and seeking to hold together the tensions that can occur between these two areas. And many of us, I'm sure, will have had the experience of moving through one of these areas, whether it's the time when we felt that they were clearly in conflict, or dealing with different questions, or they were actually something that where you could bring together and develop conversation and the interface between science and religion. In my own case, I left school at 16, so I'm not a very good advert for those who are promoting the idea of staying on until 18. But when I went to university at 18, so I switched at that point from art subjects, because I'd done A-levels in art subjects by the age of 16. I went to university, I switched to science, and the other thing that happened, which was perhaps the most important thing, and that eventually led on to a PhD in animal physiology, but the most important thing, as far as I was concerned during that period, was my own decision to make a personal commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ and to take that as a position for the future and to look at the implications of that in terms of daily living and daily experience. I actually offered to go abroad as an agricultural missionary. It's one of the areas I was particularly interested in at the time, but the committee turned me down and they said I should stay in academia, and so I stayed doing full-time research, well, teaching first of all here in Cambridge, but then going on into full-time research, which I've been involved in ever since, until a few years ago. The type of research I was interested in and developed over quite a long period was to do with how hormones act in the body, their mechanism of action, what they do, and trying to tease out the biochemistry, the molecular actions of hormones which have a very considerable influence on how our bodies function. I was especially interested in the question of how is it that the mother knows she is pregnant? What are the very early signals that are produced by the very early embryo that causes the mother to switch and changes her physiology? I was also interested in the question of what switches on the delivery of the fetus at the end of pregnancy. It's a very complicated, interactive period and a huge area of complexity in terms of the signals that go between the fetus and the mother at that time that will lead to the delivery of the birth of the young. And in this context, I was interested in the evolution of what is referred to as the evolution of viviparity. That is, why is it that so many species choose viviparity, the birth of living young, as their preferred mode of reproduction? And this is true of nearly all mammals, not every mammal, but most mammals. And it's true of quite a lot of other species in lower orders. So these are some of the areas at a research level that I've worked in the past. But as you'll see in a moment, a lot of this came in rather usefully later on, because I came very much involved with the ethics of cloning and stem cells and fertility control. Laboratory research is a wonderful life, and one of the things that it brings to you is visitors who come to your laboratory and hopefully are interested in the work that you're doing. And two come to mind. Juming Wang was a medical doctor from Nanking who came to my department in 1979, and I was astonished. For some reason, when I received his papers, I picked him out as somebody. And this was a time when one was really dubious about having Chinese, because very often they couldn't speak English, and secondly, they had very little relevant experience. He came into my office and sat down, and we held a conversation in English when I discovered he had perfect English. I couldn't believe it. then I discovered he had grown up in a missionary school in China. It was a school that was actually started by Hudson Taylor, who was one of the founder missionaries, Protestant missionaries in China. He'd been through terrible experiences during the Cultural Revolution. He'd been sent to the countryside to be educated. He separated from his family, and I eventually discovered, it took 6 months before he dared tell me, he was a secret believer. And it was one of those really moving experiences of somebody who had been through deep experiences. And I know there are some of you here with whom this will resonate already. He taught me a lot about China. I became very fascinated by it, and eventually his eldest son, he had 4 sons, 3 sons and a daughter. All 3 sons took PhDs in the West, and his eldest son came to work with me, did his PhD here, is now, then went on to San Diego, and he's now back in Shanghai, and he runs one of China's largest companies dedicated to the discovery of new drugs for medical treatment. The second person was a student I noticed when I went to Shanghai in 1980. Thought she was a very bright girl. Came from Harbin, which is up in the north. We invited her to come over to the UK. She did her PhD with us. She became a Christian, and today she holds the high office of a Vice Minister for Population and Health for the whole of China. She's responsible for family planning for the whole of China. So, just staying with China for a moment, I first went there in 1979 with the World Health Organization. They wanted to set up a basic research program, and they asked if I would help them to do that in the Family Planning Institute in Shanghai, which became the world's largest family planning institute. Later, I worked with the UK-China Forum, which was headed by Michael Heseltine, and that was mostly on environmental issues. And then I went on to do studies in Africa in biotechnology. Can you use biotechnology to address the problems of food security in a global population predicted to reach 8 billion by 2020? And now, as Rodney indicated, our work is mostly to do with sustainability and climate change and some of the issues that are thrown up by that, and you'll be hearing more of that later on. But throughout, there have been some real opportunities for Christian witness, and there have been some real challenges concerning social engagement over topics like health and welfare issues, care for the environment, intergenerational responsibilities, the common good, and there's been a various degree of success and frustration, as you can imagine, in those sorts of areas. But I suppose my life as a Christian in science changed when I became a Fellow of the Royal Society, and you have to sign this famous book, which goes back to the foundation of the Society in 1660. It goes back to the founders, many of whom, of course, were men of faith, and many great names among them, as I'm sure you know. I was just about to sign the book in the ceremony you have to go through, and the librarian came up alongside me and she said, "You know what FRS stands for, don't you?" And I looked at her and she said, "FRS really stands for research, further research suspended." And to some extent she was correct. Those of you who are not familiar with the Royal Society, it is the UK's senior academy of science. It's the oldest continuing academy of science in the world, and it has a number of about 1,500 fellows altogether, I suppose. Now, shortly after that, I was elected Vice President and Foreign Secretary, and on one occasion I remember going to a dinner in London and was introduced to the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, who was Foreign Secretary of Margaret Thatcher's government. And I was introduced to him as an active Foreign Secretary meeting a former Foreign Secretary. And he turned to me and said, "Where did you get that title from?" So I replied that in 1660, Charles II formalised the establishment of the Royal Society, and about 50 years later, it was agreed to have a foreign secretary who looked after international matters and the affairs of the society. And about 100 years after that, the government thought it was quite a good idea. Now, the advances in the biological sciences, which George Ellis referred to as soft sciences and almost soft sciences, and I think we might well take exception to that.
I think so. I shook my head at the time.
But there's no doubt about it, the biological sciences these days, because of the speed and the growth of the science, has a reputation for quite rapidly colliding with ethical issues. The ethical dimension. And my portfolio at the Royal Society was quite a big one. I had GM crops, stem cells, cloning, animal experimentation, biological weapons, environmental degradation, and food security. And nearly all those, of course, brought you directly into contact with hot issues. And I was soon reminded of the limitations of giving science advice and getting involved in these areas, because that's one of the key things that the Royal Society has responsibility for, to try to give advice to government and other groups. About a century ago, fellows of the Royal Society who became involved in this sort of science advice cautioned the government about the danger of trains travelling above 30 miles an hour. And they were very worried that the air that was drawn out of the carriages would deprive passengers of oxygen, and it would lead to whole-scale fatalities. And for this reason, there is a strong case for entertaining an open mind. In other words, science moves on. And I couldn't help thinking tonight when George Ellis was saying that the picture with regards to multiverse is concerned very much with hypothetical issues, and one wonders what the situation might be in a century's time when you think back a century to some of the things that fellows of the Royal Society were saying to the government. And if we fail to approach science with an open mind, it can result in hubris and self-interest. I was always so struck by the man who invented the laser, Charles Townes, who won a Nobel Prize quite a long time ago, but he won the Templeton Prize just a few years ago. And I had the privilege of being involved on the occasion that he received the prize in Buckingham Palace, and then there was an event afterwards. And Charles is a very humble man. He's in his 80s, and he was given this huge cheque from the Templeton Foundation. So what did he do? He broke it down. He had it already broken down into various envelopes. The first envelope he gave to the pastor of his church. It was about $1 million. The second envelope he gave to a friend of his who he had been at school with, who was involved in helping people with disabilities. And the third cheque he gave to his wife to help her with her work among homeless in San Francisco. And he then spoke about how important it was to keep an open mind as a Christian. It was a very moving occasion, a very telling occasion, because he really put his finger on something many of us felt, which has to be real for scientists, otherwise you can go very badly astray. And failure to approach faith, I think, with an open mind is also quite worrying, because it can feed injustice and prejudice. Like the Edinburgh preacher who once prayed about evolution: Lord, don't let it be true. If it is true, don't let it be widely known. And there was a famous Jewish physicist, also Nobel Prize winner, Isaac Rabi, who saw science as a means of transcendence. And to him, doing great physics was walking the path of God, and he wrote about this. And he said, whenever one of my students came to me with a scientific project, I asked only one question: will it bring you closer to God? I wish I'd read that story years ago, and it might have been a very helpful and important line to use with one's own students, but here was one of the world's great physicists asking a key question. And the amazing statement, I think, that has always seemed to me such an incredible statement in Colossians, that Christ is before all things, and in him all things were made, and all things hold together. And I think that for many of us who are Christians in science, it is still very much the defining issue, it is the defining premise, that before all that we might discover in science, and before the world was created, all things were in Christ. Science makes windows, it seems to me, into God's world, but understanding what we see through those windows isn't easy, or sometimes very perplexing, and it can lead to fireworks. As Rodney said, we are both connected with St Edmund's College, which is the college next door, and speaking of fireworks, it's quite timely to remind ourselves that last night, of course, we remembered Guy Fawkes Night. And Guy Fawkes, of course, in 1605 was trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and he was a Catholic, and St Edmund's College was founded in 1896 for the purpose of enabling Catholics to gain entrance to the University of Cambridge and to be taught there. And although there's no religious test today, we have the privilege and the opportunity of meeting like this, with the freedom of meeting like this, for the study of science and religion, having in mind that much earlier there were some real fireworks. And we may well face fireworks, we are facing fireworks in this area of science and religion debate at the moment. It's a very topical subject for us to be considering, but we can rejoice in the freedom that we have in order to debate this.
It's a great start. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Do we like to ask some questions to Ryan? Can I pick up perhaps on what you were saying just towards the end there? Because a conversation came up earlier, back up after the George Ellis lecture, about the Royal Society and the fact that they have sponsored, or the Templeton Foundation has sponsored some lectures. They sponsored Bernard Carr launching his book on multiverses there and so on. And yet the Royal Society has rather clamped down on such things now, I think, which is, you know about that?
Yes. Yes, it is the case that the previous president was a man called Lord May of Oxford, who was a very distinguished mathematician and theoretical physicist, and now distinguished for his work in ecology. Although I think he would say in his strong Australian accent that he's definitely an atheist, he was a person who was sufficiently of what I was just describing, an open mind, that he did provide the opportunity, in consultation with senior members of Council of the Royal Society, to put on a series of lectures funded by Templeton. John Polkinghorne was one of the speakers, George Ellis gave one, and so on. And we've now had 4. Martin Novak spoke about evolution and evolutionary biology, and the third one was by an Islamic scholar. As you can imagine, or perhaps you can't imagine what it's like, but if we just go back in history to the foundation of the Royal Society with people like Isaac Newton, Christopher Wren, and so on and so forth, as I said, these are very often men of strong faith. And that continued with people like Michael Faraday, of course, in particular, after which the Institute is named. And it's true that the charter, the first charter that Charles II issued in 1662, says that all experimentation and research should be done to the glory of God. And so people who are elected to the Royal Society, of whom these days, of course, there are many people who would be of no faith, we are actually standing in the footsteps of people who took that position in the early stage. But it's absolutely true what you say, that of course, as we all now know, we moved into this very strongly secular dimension, which means that the majority of people in the Royal Society would not have any faith at all, and some of them would be violently against the idea of the Royal Society having anything to do with religion. Now, of course, there's a very interesting point to make at this stage, and that is that the Royal Society was set up, as Bob White said, who was chairing this evening, with the idea that you should not believe anybody unless you can test what they say. And in this particular case, of course, it was testing by experimentation. So this was a fundamental challenge to all that had gone before in the history of science, the Aristotelianism, which says you accept basically what I tell you, what I teach you. You accept it by rote and that's it. And it's handed down from generation to generation. But now, the beginning of what has become known as the beginning of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, this was the beginning of the start of testing everything. And so those strange men who advised that the train shouldn't go more than 30 miles an hour, you know, what experiments they've done, what tests have they done? It's exactly what George Ellis was talking about tonight. But of course now we've swung entirely to the other side, where the view would be, yes, you must test absolutely everything, don't believe anything unless you have proof experimentally that this is the truth. Sadly, during that period, the book of life, the teaching of scriptures, the teaching of theology, the teaching about God has faded, tremendously faded. Whereas the teaching that comes from what some people refer to as the book of nature, that is what you can learn about the world itself, and what experiment, what you can do that tells you what is truth, that has become very much in the ascendancy.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the non-overlapping magisterial principle earlier on. It's interesting hearing Professor Ellis's lecture earlier, how he's really concerned that this principle that everything must be tested is being undermined by things like the multiverse proposition. And does that perhaps work against you in the sense of trying to develop science and religion studies? Because actually, if scientists are saying, well, we mustn't sort of dabble in the two, then actually it's going to be much harder, isn't it, to kind of bring science and religion together?
Yes. And I think this is where we come to the interesting contrast between the natural sciences and the biological sciences. So George Ellis was speaking very much as a physicist, as a cosmologist, describing, and of course George also has a great interest in neurobiology and neurosciences in the brain, which he would say are far more complicated than this stuff. Physics and cosmology, which we as biologists think is terrible to understand and get hold of. I think we do have a division here in our perspective, because whereas, and of course this might be on a time sequence, that what we're dealing with is that the physicists and the cosmologists have gone so much further in depth in their science, whereas in the biological sciences, we've only recently begun to understand the genetic code in much greater detail and how it functions. We still don't have a good hold in terms of hard science on how our brains function, how we take decisions, how we're influenced by externalities, and the whole area of psychology and consciousness. And these are still areas that have to be probed deeply. And we're nowhere near the stage of being able to start speculating about the equivalent of multiverse. That is, what would be the equivalent in the biological sciences? I suppose consciousness.
Yeah.
And if you believe in telepathy, probably communication. So I think perhaps I would want to respond initially in that way to your point. I thought it was fascinating how he showed that it seems almost as if physics is going back on itself, because it's now moved into this highly theoretical area for which it's obviously going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to obtain factual information. So perhaps non-magisterial overlap will have to be revised.
Question?
I've heard it said that research grants are often denied or withdrawn from creationists. How true is that?
I'm not sure I can answer that with factual information. If we just look at the process by which the research grants are obtained, the preferred route these days, and I'm now speaking about the biological sciences, is that you would draft an outline proposal of what you would like to do, and that would be a pre-proposal which would go into a vetting group which would be experts in the field. Of course, those experts these days would be primarily, let's take evolution as the case, those experts, well, we needn't take evolution specifically, we could be talking about evolutionary processes in terms of biology, but we could also be speaking about the created order of the universe. But let me stay with the biological side, because that I know better. My guess is that at that point, such a submission would not score highly, and would probably not go to the next stage, because if there was evidence that the information was contradicting scientific knowledge that has been established, that is, supposing it's to do with a project which is considering that the Earth, that we're dealing with a young Earth of only 6,000 years old, where all the scientific evidence tells us that the Earth is very much older than that. I think that I suspect that would not get much further than the pre-submission stage. So, unless, of course, there is something very original in the idea that is being put forward. At the moment, I think it would be difficult to know what that is.
Yeah.
But I could just, I mean, I'm speaking here of the UK research councils which are dealing with public money that is given for hard science. I'm not speaking of other organisations that may have a very different mission and very different purpose, and might well adopt a different position. But of course the UK research councils are the ones that handle the largest sums of money, with one exception, and that is the Wellcome Trust, which is the world's largest medical trust.
Yeah.
In physics, you've got the uncertainty principle. Is there an equivalent of that in the biological science?
Oh yes, absolutely. And very many parallels, because, and for a number of reasons. One being, well, let's just take mutation, for example, which you'll hear about later, because you don't know, it's impossible to predict in the genetic code where a mutation is going to occur. There may be certain areas of the code where there's perhaps a tendency for mutations to occur, but generally speaking, wouldn't you agree the uncertainty principle would definitely apply there. And I think the other, well, let's think of climate change as well, which you're going to hear about later, I suspect.
Yes, indeed.
Where, in terms of the forecasting of what is actually happening as a result of human activities impinging on our climate and on the build-up of CO2 levels, which are having this, what most scientists in the field would now consider are serious changes that are occurring to the world in which we live, and that humanity really needs to do something about it. I mean, there are still uncertainties to some of that science, even though as you follow through what's happened over the last decade, the knowledge has been increasingly strengthened to suggest that climate change is definitely happening and that it is due to human activity.
Just can I draw you out of it though? I would understand that uncertainty at that point, or at this point, would be due to, or points to the need for more effort and more time to gather more evidence.
Mm.
And then, say, in a few years' time, those uncertainties would be removed.
Mm.
With Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it's a logical uncertainty, it's not a gap.
Yeah.
Is there an equivalent of a logical uncertainty in biology?
Not sure there is, but
The mutations aren't quantum events then, I suppose.
no. Well, at this stage of knowledge, then not. But I can't answer that. I don't know that field well enough to be able to give you a sensible response.
I mean, you're quite right in that there are, because of the particular composition of a gene and its position within the structural nucleus, there are mutation hotspots, and these are presumably areas. But you're also right in saying that because mutation is a stochastic process, you cannot predict with any degree of certainty which gene is going to mutate and which one isn't. Another example we might give is the prediction of neuronal connections in the developing brain, where there are many more neuronal connections than you can possibly regulate by genetic means.
Yes, yes. No, that is a good
You're nowhere
example.
predicting how they're going to form.
Yeah.
Yes, you described earlier on that parallel development of science and technology and religion as being leading to, you used the words, a cultural battle. If that is the case, how can we as a Christian community support you command those? I was thinking that particularly, would you advocate a kind of church militant approach in response to, say, the secular atheism? What's the kind of view you take on that?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that's happening with this growth of militant atheism in this country and in North America is that it is making Christians come out. In other words, I think we've had it too easy for too long, and we now have a serious battle with militant atheists who are very capable and very able at communication and at dominating the media. And so we have a very different situation. I think certainly it's not one that I can think back over my lifetime, and I suppose we go back to Bertrand Russell, that he was, compared with what we're seeing at the moment, there wasn't the ability to dominate the airwaves and the television screen in the way that some of these guys are doing it. Now, of course, the USA is a particularly interesting example in this, and I don't want this to be interpreted as an anti-American pitch, because it isn't. I have a lot of regard for America, and our eldest son lives in America and so on and so forth. But the situation there is that the attacks I will mention Dawkins at this point. I had an email last week which said that Richard Dawkins was making the point that American overseas policy, foreign policy, is determined by a group of Jewish people who, of course, place Israel at a very high level in terms of their considerations. Why don't we then set up, says Dawkins, a bureau next to the White House which is anti-religion, for the destruction and the removal of religion? It includes Hitchens, it includes Sam Harris. So here is an attempt to actually set up a militant movement of atheism to influence government policy. So now let me give you another example of what's happening, which is also very disturbing in the USA, and that is the conversion that one of the evangelical leaders underwent when he heard Sir John Horton talking about climate change. As you know, John Horton is a Christian. He was the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and John is very convinced, in his quiet, gentlemanly way, that we are entering a very serious phase in terms of the survival of humankind as we know it. Richard Cizik went back to the evangelicals in southern states, split the evangelical movement in half. The 30 million evangelicals who voted for Bush split down the middle over the question of climate change. And it's quite clear that what is happening here in the USA, I think, it is clear that first of all we are seeing the rise of a militancy of atheists which are becoming quite dominant and very active. It's happening also because people like Dawkins are making a pitch against those in the States who do not accept evolution. And this, of course, is a red rag to Richard Dawkins, and is an extraordinary situation in the States, the most advanced technological country in the world, where 50% of them still don't believe in evolution. And the mix of these activities together with the climate change debate, which is splitting Christians, some saying they really should stay focused entirely on salvation and commitment to the gospel, and they shouldn't become involved in social change, and others saying, yes, we should become involved in social change because that's part of our Christian responsibility. So I think there is a very strong possibility, I hope and pray there is, that in fact, as Christians, there will be a response to some of these issues, that we will recognise that we are being challenged to do with some very key aspects of faith, belief in God, and also at the way in which we relate and care for the world in which we live. So yes, I think we may well see a response, but this is why it's so important for people like you to tell us how you're going to take a lead. And just to let you off the hook, how many of you are from Cambridgeshire? Anybody? No? Okay, I can tell you this story. The diocesan, the person who's responsible, I'm a Baptist actually, so let me state my position. But in the Anglican churches here in the diocese, the leader on issues to do with climate change has tried to hold a meeting of all ministers, of all church leaders in this diocese. He showed Al Gore's film, The Inconvenient Truth. 3 people turned up.
Question from the front.
I think you made a reference to underneath the Noma situation that you saw at a deep level are coming together, or an origin, or however. Can you go a little deeper? Can you lead us a little way on that?
Well, I think I have to take you back to where I finished, which was Colossians. And I think for me, as I felt, I suppose, from the very early days when I made a Christian commitment, that whatever science throws at you, and I sign up entirely to the view that science is one way to truth. I have no reservations about that whatsoever. But whatever science may throw at you which seems to conflict with the faith, I always have to go back to Colossians, because it has to be that Christ was there at the beginning and it was all in Christ, and therefore we have to find a way through that particular problem. So those are areas that I've had to explore and continue to have to explore, because these things go on, of course, because science makes these advances. I suppose the classic example is, or one of the examples that one can use, is the way in which there have been statements that have been made about the faith and about a particular position that should be adopted, where science has subsequently shown that that cannot be the case. And therefore your faith, the Galileo story is the classic example, of course, but there are others which are more modern and more recent at that. And there's a theologian, a Catholic theologian, Ernan Macmillan, who sometimes comes to take part in these courses, who has written very helpfully, and I find him to have some wonderful insights into this aspect of how, of being very careful that you don't position yourself in such a way that science comes along and takes the ground from under the position that you've adopted. It's what Charles Colson used to call about the danger of adopting a position of God of the gaps. Anything you can't explain, well, it must be due to God. That doesn't help.
Yes. Thank you.
You just quoted a book, or a person, a book, Macmillan.
Ernan Macmillan, McMullin. Ernan was on the committee that brought Galileo back into the Catholic Church in 1992. So he's a great scholar in the field of history and philosophy of science, but he's also a very devout Christian man, and I think has got a lot to teach us about this particular conflict that can arise for some of us, where we suddenly find ourselves confronted by some new insight of science which is secure, which then impinges on how we interpret the faith that we've previously adopted and accepted ourselves.
Yeah. That would be facetious, but I go back. I always remember Dave Allen, who always used to finish up his routines with "May your God go with you," and I felt that was very emblematic of a kind of period where the idea was, oh well, religion, that's fine. Whatever your religion is, that's fine. That's up to you. You just get on with it. And it seems to me that now lines are hardening in many ways, and I find we're starting to get people in the parishes who are saying, "Oh, we couldn't possibly have a funeral in church because we're not religious," or we couldn't possibly, I feel we're growing into a point where people are feeling the pressure to identify themselves.
Mm.
You know, it's no longer good enough to put C of E on the hospital form or whatever, or it's. And I wonder if this whole sort of militant atheism thing is feeding on that. People feeling that they've got to declare themselves either for or against, and they can't be neutral any longer and just kind of.
Is that a good thing, do you think?
I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes. You know, if the general population feel that they are under pressure to declare themselves believers or non-believers, you know, what proportion will go which way?
Mm. I suppose we've been through quite a phase, haven't we, where a number of people have been associated with churches, and it's been a benefit and it's been helpful to them, but it's perhaps a social association rather than a degree of conviction about what they actually believe and what they got hold of for themselves. Those are always difficult areas to deal with because we very quickly then push that argument towards the fundamentalist sect, where everything, sector, where everything has to be cut and dried, defined, and it makes life much easier, I suppose. And so you'll notice if you read these articles in The Economist that one of the writers makes the particular point about the way in which there's been this enormous growth in Pentecostalism, and that one of the reasons for that is that it's clear-cut, it's very defined, it's experiential, and so on and so forth. So there, I suppose, you would have a sector where people have identified with that particular style. We had a meeting in Los Angeles a year ago, funded by the Templeton Foundation, on the centenary of the foundation of the Pentecostal Church in Azusa, in Los Angeles. And it was fascinating to hear about the growth and the theology behind the Pentecostal movement from scholars in the field, and its expansion particularly in countries like South America. And there was a real sense in which that church, of course, has been very much dominated by signs and wonders, but is now developing into other aspects of Christian understanding and involvement. So I suppose this might be an example of where Pentecostalism, of course, is still growing, perhaps the hard-edged way that you were suggesting, but I think there are other dimensions happening as well within the Pentecostal Church at the moment, which we need to take note of. But I think your point is a very interesting one. And I had an email today from somebody at OECD in Paris who is interested in asking the question, what would a society look like if it was dominated by the scientific materialism that seems to be growing and is expanding so much at the present time? Let's ask the question, what would that society look like? What would it consist of? What would it deal with? What are the problems it would address? Would there be any compassion? Would there be any pastoral role? And so on. And I think that is an interesting scenario to expose and to think about.
Interesting again in light of what George Ellis was saying about purpose and meaning and love and those sorts of things, which are not part of physics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you put that very well.
Yeah. We ought to be drawing to a close, I think, because there are some drinks awaiting for us. But maybe we'll take these last. Oh gosh, all the hands go up.
So we can. Should we take 3 or 4 and then?
Yeah.
I'll make a
Okay.
comment.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I just wanted to chip in from the last question. Actually, I'll try and keep it brief. If you come here and listen to you speaking, it's very easy to see this battle for the mind of the country, or if you read Dawkins or the Church Times or whatever. But actually, then my experience when you're out in the parish is that actually most people don't think like that. And I think maybe there is a section of the population that reads books and is very interested in these things. But there's another section who actually are still at the level of what is basically folk religion, to be honest. It doesn't make it any better. I'm just saying that there's other things going on as well. Just a comment, really.
Okay. Christian apologists have long liked to point to the uniqueness of human beings and to try to say, well, look, everything you see in the animal kingdom provides a genetic route, biological route to some of that, but there's this huge quantum leap, this difference, which you've got to account for somehow. It seems to me that recent work in animal studies has begun to close that gap, almost one might say alarmingly, with altruism in chimps and with elephants recognizing themselves in mirrors and so on. What's happening?
That's a good question.
Do you have somebody speaking on this aspect?
Not this time, I don't think, 'cause we've had had
I'll wait
Jeff
for flag.
Schloss speak about that.
I'll wave the flag a bit on that.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
okay. John.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fascinating and very important area. One comment I would make initially to that is that it's perhaps not a bad thing, actually, that we are no longer seeing ourselves as so superior, that there are some commonalities and that we have, and certainly there is some very fascinating work showing, for example, that there are pieces in our genome, pieces of DNA, which are what are called retroviruses, which are exactly the same as in chimpanzees and in some of the other primates. And they've just been carried through. That is, it really shows this common descent and the relationship that we do have with other species. I think there's been a great danger, a great tendency in the past to think that we are so different. However, there is, of course, the major difference, and that has to do with brain size. And this, of course, is where there is this dramatic difference compared with any other species. And as scientific work goes on to try to understand things like memory, cognition, relationships, altruism, these are all things that are being intensively studied these days with all the new tools that are available. And we're going to learn a great deal about this. And it might well help to throw light on the question of why do we respond to God? What is this relationship that we try to find and seek after? And again, there's a very interesting comment in one of these articles in The Economist which draws attention to the extent to which, and it really relates back to the point I made right at the beginning in the letter that the President of Iran wrote to President Bush, whether we like it or not, he said, there seem to be more and more people who are reaching out to the Almighty. And that this, so the point drawn from that is that this is something that is common across the whole range of humanity.
Yes, I've always liked to say, you never see a dog staring at the sunset. I'm beginning to wonder. Just that I haven't seen them doesn't mean to say that dogs never stare at sunsets.
No dogs composed a symphony comparable with Mozart or any symphony. There are areas where we try and say that.
But somebody soon is going to tell us that a bird has whistled one.
Yeah, exactly.
May I ask one? You mentioned earlier on that your series of talks at the Royal Society, you had a Muslim speaker, and you just mentioned President Ahmadinejad. What is the Muslim view of cosmology, Big Bang Theory, Darwinism, and so on?
I'm not an expert on Islam, but my understanding is that certainly if we consider cosmology, a lot would say that much of this is work that they did themselves. And if you go back historically to the time of the golden age of Islam's discovery, scientific discoveries, of course, this was happening in the period from about 900 to 1400. And it's fascinating if you go to Toledo in Spain, where you find the historical evidence of the way in which the Muslims, the Jews and the Christians lived in that area. They were the key translators of the Arab knowledge, scientific knowledge, which was the avenue by which that information came into Europe through the Greeks and through Latin. So Islam has actually had a remarkable history in terms of scientific endeavour. The great question, of course, is why did that subside? Why did it not continue? And why is it that Islam never really entered either into a phase of scrutiny and examination of their holy texts? And why is it that they still use the holy texts that applied in those days without really having had any critical analysis? One possible explanation is that these were texts that were written for a rural community in dispersed areas of that part of the world. And there was never the scholarship that went into a critical examination. Of course, the other explanation is that they weren't allowed to do it. They weren't allowed to change it. They weren't allowed to modify or interpret. They had to accept the holy text as it is. When you come to questions like evolution and genetic engineering, for example, then you could have very much the situation that you would find in the Christian community and in other religious communities. That is, there are those who say, for example, let me take genetic engineering as an example. The younger Muslim scholars would say, I don't see a problem with this. This is something that's going to be beneficial to humankind, provided we control it and have the right regulations, then we can use it. And these are things that might be of great importance to us in the future. The older scholar would say, the elderly imam would say, no, DNA is sacrosanct. You're not allowed to touch it. You must not change it. You must keep everything as it was previously. They totally ignore the fact that humans have bred different species over hundreds and thousands of years, and so that doesn't count. You must not in any way interfere. So you've got the diversity. And you may know that there's been a publication that has been funded by somebody in
Harun Yahya, you're going to talk.
He's got a huge amount of money into producing a magnificent book which is distributed worldwide for free, which is a document denying evolution and showing the wonders of the created order from a strict creationist viewpoint. So Islam is complex, and there isn't a simple answer to your question. If I go back to the Royal Society lecture which I attended, and incidentally I must tell you that all 4 lectures were in an absolute full house. It was overspill, which has been noted by quite a number of fellows. But one of the last question that Sardar was asked was from a young Muslim girl with headscarf who said words to the effect, of course all this experimentation about evolution is irrelevant, it's unimportant, it's wrong. She totally dismissed whole areas of science as being incorrect. He challenged her, but it was, I think, indicative of the tensions that existed among the younger community, let alone the older community, in terms of some of these issues. So I think what we maybe feel that we're having to face as Christians, I think there are other religions that are having to face some of these questions as well.
Thank you. Maybe the final question, do you think? No? Yeah.
Yeah, because of the tape.
Yeah.
The question of becoming clearer in our views in the light of the secular war, if you like, and the fact that there are such as one professor comes to mind, Professor Sanford. Have you read his book, Population Genetics? Is quite well known. He's come out with a creationist perspective,
Uh-huh.
having retired,
Oh, right, yes.
and sort of it came along the line that I didn't feel like he'd come out earlier because I knew I would be ostracised or something like that,
Right.
and yet persuaded in his own mind. Now, there was one question about our creationists denied funding, etc.
Yes.
In that sort of position that we're in, in your position, you're so exposed, you know, you're distinguished, you've got a huge, you know, backdrop of, you know, of achievement, etc. And there must be many in that situation who have to look at things, well, if I do say something more clearly, will I suffer? Do you find that as a tension sometimes?
Yes, it's a challenge because I go back to this point about where you find that the science is actually telling you that we don't live in a young Earth, and we do live in a world that was created a very long time ago, and that the processes that have brought us to where we are now have taken an extremely long time. And there's a great deal that modern science tells us about that. And I find it, I can't deny that. I mean, that is scientifically programmed and established. And to me, that is one of the routes to truth. It's by no means the only one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here tonight.
I suppose the point that comes through that there are evidences put forward or methods of interpretation which, such as Professor Sanford has become more convinced about.
Yes.
You know, and if you've got 30 years of a certain paradigm in your mind, which is there, you know, to change that paradigm, which essentially is a huge thing, isn't it?
That's the importance of the open mind.
Yes.
And I mean, there's been a very interesting and a continuing battle over intelligent design. Nobody's raised that yet, but let's just touch on that to finish. That there is it's a strong movement, as you know, in the USA, and it's coming in this country. It's already in this country. It's going to New Zealand. It's spreading quite widely. There's a very interesting professor of molecular biology in New England called Ken Murray, who has looked at the things that intelligent design people say prove that there is an intelligent design. For example, on bacteria there's a flagellum like a whip, and his argument would be some of these things are so complex you couldn't believe that they came from evolution, because you couldn't think of something that will put together an organism that had such a degree of complexity. How could it possibly have evolved by all these different steps? Therefore, it must have been by intelligent design, putting bits and pieces together, which then resulted in this organism with its whipping tail. Now, Murray says, I'm sorry, that is no longer tenable, because the science shows us that those genes have been present from extremely early times, from millions of years ago, in different types of organisms, and they were gradually evolving into something that eventually ended up with a bacterium with a flagellum. And he has made a very striking video showing the science of how this can be done. Now, I think this is the problem, of course. How do you get across some of these complex scientific descriptions so that, I mean, our role as in our churches is not to give scientific descriptions, but on the other hand, I think we have to draw attention to where there is ambiguity or contradiction because of what the science now tells us. And therefore, when we come to people who are concerned, deeply concerned about creationism and have a deep commitment to it, I think we have to gently point out, and we have to direct them to those areas where there's both reading, there's help and information, there are videos, there are lectures, and all the range of things that help people to understand that science has actually taken us a very long way in our understanding of a number of these things. I know it won't suit everybody.
I just wonder whether there is a point at which the plausibility element needs to come into it,
Yeah.
where there's a recognition that, if you like, well, yes, within possibilities, I understand your argument.
Yes.
You know, and I don't think that there's no engagement at the moment, as I understand it, between,
No.
you know, yeah.
I think that's right, and we find it here in our own churches. I'm thinking of some very close friends of ours, and we quite often meet together, and it was only last week that we discovered there's one aspect where the science tells me, and I think tells other scientists, a very clear position, but they're miles away from it, and they've never really wanted to consider it, and I don't think they want to now. And I'm not criticising them. I think we just have to find whether there's a way in which we can both be open to each other and have open minds, so that we can draw attention to the way in which this might lead to a better understanding. But it's a challenge.
Well, I think we'd better draw to a close. We will have more on evolution tomorrow. Dennis Alexander will be talking about that, and we'll also have Gordon Wenham talking about how one might interpret Genesis. So I think more of these topics will be coming up and considered. So, but in the meantime, thank you very, very much for running through this.